Hello! I hope you find this story fascinating and thought-provoking. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome. George sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle in the fire. Outside the window, snow was slowly falling, covering the yard with a soft white carpet. The house was silent, broken only by the clock on the wall, which methodically counted down the time. George had long dreamed of bringing his family together under one roof. The last time they celebrated Christmas together was more than 10 years ago, when his wife Elizabeth was still alive. After her death, their meetings became rare and their relationship strained. This year, he decided to do everything he could to recapture the warm connection they used to have. He sent out invitations to his children, Adam, Linda, and Mark. In the letters he wrote, "This year I want us to spend Christmas together as a family. Let it be a special evening that we will remember for the rest of our lives." But in his heart, George felt that something could go wrong. Adam, the eldest son, had always been ambitious and stubborn. He was running his own business, but lately he had been calling his father frequently, asking for financial help. Linda, the middle child, worked as a lawyer. She had always been her mother's favorite, but after her death, she began to communicate less often with George. Mark, the youngest son, has always been a dreamer. He worked as an artist and lived very modestly. George stood up and looked at the festively decorated room. Of all the details were perfect. The Christmas tree, which he had chosen himself, was shining with lights. Plates of cookies and candy were already on the table. But his heart was restless. He remembered what his neighbor Bob had said a few days earlier, offhandedly. "George, do your kids know about the will?" This question made him think. Of course they knew. But they really care about his estate, or did they just want to be with him? George looked at the picture of Elizabeth on the mantelpiece. Her smile seemed to say, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." But would it? His heart was clenching at the thought that this Christmas might not be what he had envisioned. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. George went over and opened the door. Adam stood on the doorstep, shaking the snow off his coat. "Hi, Dad," he said as he came in. George smiled, but his eyes remained alert. This was only the beginning of an evening that was to change his life forever. George was relieved to see all of his children arrive at the door. Adam was the first to arrive, followed by Linda, and finally, with some delay, Mark. It was already getting dark outside, and the snow was still falling. George hugged each of the children. His heart was filled with warmth, but somewhere in the back of his mind there was a chill of anxiety. "It's good that we are all together," he said, leading them into the living room. Adam and the children, sat down on the couch, exchanging formal greetings. Adam immediately pulled out his phone and started checking his messages. "Work again?" Linda asked, smiling slightly. "None of your business," Adam grumbled, not even looking up. Mark stood by the fireplace, looking thoughtfully at the photos of his mother. He didn't say a word, but his face betrayed a deep sadness. George, trying to lighten the atmosphere, invited everyone to sit down at the table. Dinner was already reading turkey, mashed potatoes, green peas, and a traditional pie that George had baked according to Elizabeth's recipe. "Your mom always made this pie for Christmas," he said, placing a slice on the plate. "You did a good job, Dad." Linda praised him, although her voice sounded a little insincere. During dinner, the conversation was strained. Adam talked about his business projects, but seemed annoyed when George asked for details. "Dad, don't worry. I know what I'm doing," he said. Linda talked more about her work, bragging about her new clients. Mark was silent, eating small bites, as if he was not at ease. George tried to keep a positive attitude, but it was hard for him. He felt that each of his children was here for their own reasons, and it definitely had nothing to do with family love. "How are you all? Is there anything new?" He tried to start a conversation. "I'm fine," Mark answered briefly, not even looking at his father. "Linda, don't you want to tell your dad what you think?" Adam suddenly asked, smiling slyly. "Adam?" Linda gave her brother an angry look. George felt that there was something behind those words. He didn't ask anything, but he already realized that more words would be spoken during dinner that would change everything. When dessert was served, Adam suddenly raised his glass. "Dad," he began, smiling, "we're all here because we love you, but we have something important to talk about." There was a tense silence in the room. George put down his fork and looked at the children. "What is it?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. "About the will," Adam said, and these words came like a bolt from the blue. George felt as if the air had become thick and all sounds had suddenly disappeared. He looked at each of the children, but did not see the warmth in their eyes that he had wanted to feel that evening. "Will," he asked again. "Is that what you've come to discuss?" Linda tried to calm the situation. "Dad, we just want everything to be fair." "Fair," George repeated, his voice steeled. Of the evening, which was supposed to be warm and family-friendly, suddenly began to take on a different atmosphere. George felt that this Christmas would never be the same again. He looked at his children and thought of only one thing: how far are they willing to go to get what they want? There was a tense silence in the room. George looked at his children, trying to figure out what was really going on. He noticed Adam and Linda exchanging quick glances, as if they were signaling. Mark, meanwhile, was sitting back, twirling his fork in his hands. George took a sip of water, trying to stay calm. "Etta, you want to talk about the will," he repeated, searching for words. Adam was the first to break the silence. "Dad, I've always cared about you, but you said yourself that this house is too big for you. So, George narrowed his eyes. "We just think it would be smarter if we all decided this together." Linda chimed in, "We don't want to pressure you, but we have to be realistic. Do you really want to leave the house to Mark?" He won't be able to take care of it." Mark, who had been silent until then, looked up sharply. "Why shouldn't I be able to?" he said, visibly irritated. "Or maybe you've already decided everything for me." No one has decided anything," Linda replied dryly. George felt his heart sink. In that moment he realized that his children hadn't come here for him. They were more concerned with money and possessions. "Did I understand you correctly?" he asked slowly. "You didn't come here to celebrate Christmas, but to discuss my will." "Dad, you're taking it the wrong way." Adam tried to reassure him. George found this hard to believe. His children talked about helping, but in their eyes he saw something else: greed and fear of disinheritance. "Help," he smiled sarcastically. "Help me get rid of my house." The Mark stood up from his seat, as if unable to stand the tension. "I'm tired of this," he said. "You two are always trying to solve everything for me. Do you even understand what it means to maintain a house?" Linda asked sarcastically. "So what? This is our father's house." George sat in silence, watching the argument. He realized that his children were ready to compete with each other, not for his sake, but for what he could leave them. His gaze rested on Linda, who suddenly pulled some papers out of her purse. "What is it?" George asked, his voice sounding calm, but there was something threatening in it. "Just a few ideas," Linda replied, smiling nervously. "Adam and I thought it would be easier for you if we took over." George reached out and took the papers and saw that it was a preliminary agreement to sell the house. You've already prepared the documents." His voice trembled. "Dad, it's just a formality," Adam said, trying to remain calm. George stood up abruptly from his chair. "A formality. You've decided for me how I should live my life." George walked out of the room, leaving his children in tense silence. His heart was beating like never before. He felt that his trust in them had been shattered. One question kept running through his mind: how long had they been planning this game? George stood by the window in his room, looking out at the night sky. The snow was still falling, creating the illusion of calm. But his heart was in chaos. He felt betrayed. Those he loved most now looked like predators waiting for their prey. Voices were coming from far away. The children were arguing in the living room. But George decided to go back and find out once and for all. He slowly entered the room. Adam and Linda were having a heated discussion, while Mark was sitting in the corner, silently staring at the floor. "I'm listening." George's voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it. Adam turned around first. "Dad," he began, "you don't understand. We are trying to help. We want everything to be fair." "Fair?" George asked, raising an ironic eyebrow. "And who decides what fair is? Or it's not what you think," Linda added, trying to sound confident. "We just want to avoid problems in the future." George looked at her. Problems. What kind of problems? Linda hesitated, but Adam interrupting, well, for example, Mark. You know he can't keep up with the house. We don't want him to get into debt. Mark stood up abruptly. I'm not a little boy to be decided for. Ma, he said, glaring at Adam. Maybe you should look at your debts before you blame anyone. The argument between the brothers grew louder. George raised his hand to stop them. That's enough, he shouted. The room fell silent. George took a deep breath and continuing. You think you know what's best for me, but you haven't even asked me what I want. Dad, it's not like that. Linda tried to explain. We just want to make sure everything is okay. Anaka, okay for who? For me or for you? His voice was harsh, and every word sounded like a blow. George took the same papers he had found earlier from his pocket. You prepared the agreement to sell my house, he said, holding the documents in his hands. You decided everything for me without even asking. Adam shrugged his shoulders. We thought you'd agree, he said. Hi, you thought. George threw the papers on the table. You thought I was just going to sign and say thank you. Linda tried to intervene. Dad, it's just a proposal. An offer. You call that an offer? George looked at her with such pain that she couldn't bear to look at him. George turned to Mark. What do you think, son? He asked. Mark slowly raised his head. And I think they had no right to do that behind your back, he said quietly. These words sounded like thunder. George thought he was the only sincere voice in the room. All of you leave, he finally said, his voice calm but firm. I need to think. The children slowly left the room. George was left alone, looking at the documents on the table. His heart was broken, but he knew one thing: he had not yet said his last word. George sat in his room, trying to collect his thoughts. His hands were shaking and his heart was racing. And his eyes fell on the documents Adam and Linda had left behind. Something about them seemed suspicious. George took his glasses and began to read them carefully. At first, it looked like a standard real estate tract, but one detail raised his alarm. The document bore a signature that looked like his own. What the hell? He muttered, looking at the paper carefully. The document showed that the house had already been sold, and the worst part was that the signing date was last week. Did they forge my signature? He asked himself, his voice trembling with rage. George realized that this was not just an offer. As Linda had said, they were already acting behind his back. His hands clutched the papers so tightly that they nearly tore. He felt betrayed in the worst possible way. His own children, the ones he loved and raised, had gone to such lengths for money. Are they really capable of such a thing? He said aloud, feeling his anger gradually turn into determination. George stood up and went down to the living room where the children were sitting. Linda whispered something to Adam, and Mark, as usual, sat on the sidelines. I have a question, George said, holding the documents in his hands. All three turned to him. What is this? He asked, waving the papers around. Adam tried to remain calm. Dad, this is what we talked about. What we talked about. George raised his voice. It's a contract to sell my house. And it has my signature on it. Linda stood up, trying to take control of the situation. Dad, calm down. We just thought it was the best option. The best option. For whom? For me or for you? Mark stood up and walked closer to his father. Dad, I didn't know that, he said. I wasn't involved in this. George looked carefully at his youngest son. He saw sincerity in his eyes that he could not see in the others. Is it true, Mark? He asked. Yes, Mark nodded. I just found out today. Linda sighed, trying to find an excuse, or we didn't mean to upset you. We just thought it would help settle things. The George looked at Linda and Adam with such pain that they were silent for a moment. Do you have any idea how I feel? He said, clutching the documents in his hands. You sold my house behind my back. We thought you would understand, Adam said. Understand. Am I supposed to understand that my children are traitors? George threw the documents on the table and said, You have made your choice. Now it's my turn. He turned and went to his room, leaving the children in tense silence. George closed his room door behind him. He sat down in his chair, trying to calm down. The children's words were running through his head, and he still had those ill-fated documents in his hands. George knew he had to act quickly. He pulled out his phone and called his old friend and lawyer Thomas. "Hey, Tom, it's George. I need your help. It's urgent." An hour later, Thomas was at George's house. He listened intently as George explained the situation, showed him the documents, and explained that his signature had been forged. "This is serious," Thomas said, looking at the papers carefully. "If your signature is forged, it's fraud. But first we need to prove it." "Or what do you propose?" George asked. "First, we'll go to the notary who witnessed the signature. If there is something wrong with it, this will be the first proof. Second, you have to make sure the house hasn't been transferred to the new owners yet." George nodded. "I want everything that belongs to me back." George went downstairs with Thomas. The children were still sitting in the living room, each in their own corner, avoiding each other's eyes. "We need to talk," George said, standing in front of them. "Oh, Dad, we already explained everything," Adam said, but he sounded unsure. "No, you didn't." George looked at him. "But I'll explain it to you." He gestured for Thomas to come forward. "This is Thomas, my lawyer. He's already working on finding out how these documents came to be and who signed them." Linda tried to keep her cool. "Dad, this is unnecessary. We just wanted to help." "Help?" George raised his voice. "Help you steal my house." Adam began to defend himself. We had no bad intentions. We just wanted to make things convenient for everyone." For everyone," George smiled sarcastically. "Or maybe for you and Linda." Mark, who had been silent until then, stood up and walked over to his father. "Dad, I'm on your side," he said. "I didn't even know they did it." George looked at his son carefully and nodded. "And I believe you, Mark. But the others, Mocha?" George looked at Adam and Linda. "I want you both to know that if you did this knowingly, I will not forgive you." "Dad, it's just a misunderstanding," Linda insisted, but her voice was trembling. Thomas took the documents and promised George that he would do everything he could to sort things out. "Tomorrow morning I'll contact the notary," he said, "and we'll find out who's behind this." George took a deep breath. He knew the fight was only just beginning, but now he was sure that he would not let anyone take what was his. The next morning, George sat in his office with Thomas. The papers were lying on the table in front of them, and the phone of the notary who was to certify the documents was already on the line. George couldn't contain his excitement because this call was going to shed light on the truth. Hello," came the notary's voice. "This is George, the owner of the house on Main Street. Have you notarized the contract for the sale of my property?" he asked. The short pause on the other end of the line was telling. "Yes, I remember," the notary said. "You were present in person." George almost dropped the phone. "I wasn't there. My signature was forged." Thomas joined the conversation, asking the notary for details. It turned out that the person who introduced himself as George had provided an ID, but it wasn't him. "We have a serious case of fraud," Thomas said, hanging up the phone. "One of my children did this," George said quietly, his hands shaking. George called everyone into the living room. Adam and Linda looked tense, but Mark remained quiet as usual. I know what happened." George began, looking directly at Adam. "One of you forged my signature and sold my house." "Dad, you're wrong." Adam began to defend himself. No, I'm not." George interrupted sharply. "The notary confirmed that I was there." "But I wasn't." Linda looked down, and Adam looked embarrassed. "Did you both want to do this behind my back?" George asked, his voice pained. "Did you ever think about how I feel?" Linda broke down and began to cry. "Dad, it was Adam's idea." "He said we do it to avoid getting into trouble." Adam, furious at her words, replied, "But you didn't mind. Don't pretend you didn't know." Mark stood up from his seat. I'm tired of hearing this," he exclaimed. "You two are all about money. You don't even realize that our dad just wanted to get us together for Christmas." George held up his hand to stop the argument. That's enough," he said, his voice calm but firmer than ever. "I've realized one thing: you've lost everything I've ever tried to give you. Trust, respect, love." He looked at Mark. "You're the only one who's remained honest. You are the only one who understands that home is not just walls, but a family." George returned to the table, took out new documents and signed them. "I've already changed the will," he said, "and now you won't get anything until you learn to be a family." Adam and Linda looked shocked. "Dad, you can't do that," said Adam. "Yes, I can, and I did," George replied firmly. George left the room, leaving the children in silence. He didn't want to hear any more excuses. Now he knew who really cared about him. George sat in his chair by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He felt both relieved and sad at the same time. Everything he knew about his family now seemed to be destroyed. But was it really the end? Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the ground with a white carpet. The house was immersed in a silence that seemed both peaceful and disturbing at the same time. He remembered the moments when his children were young, when they decorated the Christmas tree together, laughing and singing Christmas songs. He could not have imagined then that someday their family would be so divided. George stood up and walked over to the fireplace, picking up a picture of his late wife Elizabeth. "Anna, you always knew how to keep us together," he whispered, "but I couldn't do it without you." Suddenly there was a soft knock on the door. George looked at his watch in surprise. It was getting late. Who could it be? Anna opening the door, he saw Mark. He was holding a box of Christmas tree ornaments. "Hi, Dad," Mark said, his voice quiet but warm. Mark, what are you doing here? I thought maybe we could decorate the tree together." Like we used to." George invited Mark into the living room. Together they began to hang old ornaments on the tree that had been in the house for decades. Each ornament brought back memories of past Christmases, of laughter, of family unity. You were always different, Mark," George said as he hung up the glass ball. "You didn't look for the easy way out." I just wanted you to be happy, Dad," Mark replied. Mark sat down next to his father, and they began to talk openly. George shared his hurts and doubts, and Mark told him how hard it was to see his brother and sister put money before family values. They weren't always like this," George said. "Maybe life has made them cruel, but that's no excuse," Mark replied. Suddenly there was another knock at the door. This time it was Linda and Adam. They stood on the doorstep looking guilty. "We wanted to apologize," Linda said, barely holding back her tears. And Adam lowered his heading. "We really didn't think it would go this far." George looked at them silently and then said, "Apologies are good, but are you ready to back up your words with deeds?" Linda nodded. "We want to make things right." George gestured to the living room. Linda and Adam joined him in decorating the tree, and gradually the tension in the room began to ease. When the tree was ready, George stood back and looked at his family. For the first time in a long time, they were together, all beat with wounds that still had to be healed. George sat back in his chair, watching the children laugh, tell stories, and reminisce about old times. He smiled, but there was something more than joy in his eyes, a hope. Thank you for watching. If you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave feedback, and stay tuned for the next videos. See you soon!